Oh, yeah, imagine this. For almost 50 years, the whole world is just holding its breath, teetering on the brink of, well, complete annihilation. We're talking late 1940s, right up to the early 90s. And the threat of nuclear war wasn't some sci-fi movie plot. It was real. A constant background hum of dread. And this wasn't your typical war, armies clashing head-on between the big players. No, this was the Cold War, a tangled global fight for influence. Think constant tension, spies everywhere, brutal proxy wars fought miles away, and this absolutely unprecedented arms race. So today, that's what we're diving into, this really extraordinary era, our mission. Let's unpack how two countries that fought together in World War II, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, came out of it as, well, bitter rivals. Their conflict split the globe and really shaped, the world we live in now. How did it all start? What were the scariest moments? And what's left of it today? Let's try and untangle it.
It really is fascinating how fast things changed after World War II ended. Europe, large parts of Asia, just devastated, unimaginable destruction, and this created a huge power vacuum. Really, only two nations had the strength to step into that void, the United States and the Soviet Union.
Right.
They became the new superpowers, but their core beliefs, their whole political and economic systems, they were polar opposites. Couldn't be more different.
Absolutely. You had the U.S. on one side, a capitalist democracy, focused on free markets, individual rights, democratic government. Their idea for the post-war world was, open societies, trade, countries choosing their own way.
And then the Soviet Union, a communist dictatorship. Their whole thing was state control of the economy, collective ownership, and this deep belief in spreading communism worldwide. They saw history marching towards this classless communist future, and capitalism, well, that was just exploitative, doomed to fail. These weren't just like philosophical disagreements, they were competing visions for humanity. And that clash, plus a whole lot of mutual suspicion and fear, really set the stage for everything that followed.
Yeah, and it didn't take long for those differences to play out, did it? Especially in Europe. After the war, Soviet troops liberated Eastern Europe from the Nazis.
Right.
But then they quickly set up communist governments there. And for the U.S. and its allies, that looked like, well, pure expansionism, red flags going up everywhere about communism spreading across the continent. So what was the West's first big move in response?
That worry pretty quickly turned into actual policy. In 1947, President Truman laid out what we now call the Truman Doctrine. It was basically a clear signal from the U.S. will help democratic nations threatened by communism, whether from outside pressure or internal groups. It was essentially containment, drawing a line.
And right after that, the Marshall Plan, which is huge. Not just a bit of aid, but billions of dollars pumped into rebuilding Western Europe. The thinking there was pretty smart, wasn't it? Rebuild economies quickly, create stability, so people wouldn't be tempted by communism out of desperation, a very different approach than after World War I. But the Soviet reaction to that plan is really telling.
Oh, absolutely. Moscow didn't see it as charity at all. They saw the Marshall Plan as the U.S. trying to buy influence, spread capitalism, and dominate Europe economically. They viewed it as, well, an economic weapon, a Trojan horse, maybe? So they refused to take part. And they forced their new satellite states in Eastern Europe to refuse it too. And that refusal, it just cemented the division of Europe economically and politically. Really tragic in a way.
And that division got even more formal, more militarized pretty quickly. 1949, you get NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was a big deal. Western Europe, the U.S., Canada, all signing up to a military alliance. Basically, an attack on one is an attack on all. A serious deterrent to the Soviets.
Which predictably led to a Soviet answer. In 1955, they created the Warsaw Pact. That was their military alliance, tying the Eastern European countries firmly to Moscow. So yeah, by the mid-50s, Europe was officially split. Militarily divided by that Iron Curtain, as Churchill famously called it. The stakes for any conflict just went way, way up.
And it wasn't just about treaties and doctrines. This whole period was punctuated by these incredibly tense crises, moments where the world genuinely seemed like it could end. The first big one was probably the Berlin Blockade in '48. You got to remember, West Berlin was this island of democracy deep inside communist East Germany. And the Soviets just cut off all roads, all railways, all canals going into West Berlin, trying to starve them out, essentially.
Yeah, and that put the West in a terrible spot. Do they give up West Berlin? Or do they risk starting World War III trying to break the blockade? They chose a third way, the Berlin airlift. Absolutely astonishing. For nearly a year, Allied planes flew in everything: food, fuel, medicine, hundreds of thousands of flights, sometimes landing every few minutes. It kept 2 million West Berliners going, an incredible display of logistics and resolve. And eventually, in '49, the Soviets had to back down and lift the blockade.
Then, just a year later, Korea. 1950 to 53. The Korean War. This is really the first major hot war of the Cold War era. Not the superpowers fighting directly, but backing opposite sides. Communist North Korea, with Soviet and Chinese support, invaded South Korea. The U.S. and UN allies jumped in to defend the South. It was brutal.
Incredibly brutal. Millions died, and it ended in a stalemate. Right back where it started, basically, with Korea divided at the 38th parallel. That division is still there today, a really stark symbol of the whole Cold War divide. But if you want the single moment where everyone, everywhere, felt like the world might actually end, that has to be October 1962.
Oof, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
Just saying, it makes you tense up. Definitely the closest call. Most dangerous moment, absolutely. U.S. spy planes discovered the Soviets are secretly building nuclear missile sites in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Kennedy's response. A naval blockade, though, they called it a quarantine, demanding the missiles be removed.
And those 13 days, I mean, the sheer terror, the world was absolutely on the edge of nuclear war. Both militaries were on highest alert. It all came down to these incredibly tense back-channel negotiations, sometimes literally arguing over single words. Eventually, thankfully, they reached a deal. The Soviets would remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, the U.S. publicly promised not to invade Cuba and secretly agreed to remove its own missiles from Turkey. It was this terrifying game of chicken that thankfully didn't end in disaster, but it changed everything.
And besides these direct, heart-stopping confrontations, the Cold War played out in other ways, too, like the arms race, that relentless drive. Both sides just poured insane amounts of money and resources into building up these massive nuclear arsenals. Enough to destroy the planet many times over. You saw the development of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear submarines, meaning an attack could come from anywhere, anytime, which led to that chilling idea of MAD, mutual assured destruction.
Right, MAD. The logic was terrifyingly simple. If both sides could utterly destroy each other, neither would dare strike first. It was supposed to keep the peace, paradoxically, through the threat of total annihilation.
And then there was the space race, another huge battleground for Cold War competition.
Yeah, it wasn't just about science, though obviously there were huge scientific leaps. It was about prestige, showing your system was superior, proving technological dominance. And let's be honest, military potential too. The Soviets really shocked the U.S. in '57 with Sputnik, the first satellite. Then again in '61, Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. Those are huge propaganda victories for them, made the West feel like they were falling behind.
But the U.S. response, the Apollo program, was just incredible. Culminating in 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon. I mean, talk about a statement. That definitely shifted the perception, put the U.S. visibly ahead in that race. But the competition wasn't always so high-tech, was it? There were also the proxy wars.
Exactly. The superpowers figured out they could fight each other indirectly by backing opposing sides in conflicts all over the developing world. Less risk of direct nuclear confrontation that way. Vietnam is probably the most famous or infamous example. 1955 to 75. The U.S. backed South Vietnam against the Communist North, which had support from the Soviets and China. It was incredibly long, incredibly costly for the U.S. in lives and money, and deeply divisive back home, and ultimately a U.S. defeat.
And Vietnam wasn't alone. You saw similar patterns in Afghanistan later on with the Soviet invasion. Conflicts in Angola, Nicaragua, places became battlegrounds for superpower influence, each side sending weapons, cash, advisors.
And all this global tension had a massive impact back home, too, inside both countries. In the U.S., you had the Red Scare, McCarthyism, this period of intense fear of communism, Senator McCarthy leading these aggressive investigations, people accused of being communists or sympathizers, often with little proof, lost their jobs, blacklisted, lives ruined, a really dark chapter for civil liberties in the U.S.
And on the Soviet side, the government used the Cold War threat, the supposed danger from America, to justify tightening its grip. More repression, more state control. Any disagreement, any dissent was crushed, all framed as necessary to protect against the external enemy. Plus constant propaganda painting the U.S. as evil and the communist system as superior. Information was totally controlled.
And if you look at those internal dynamics alongside the external conflict, you see how they fed each other, right? The external threat, real or hyped up, became a tool for domestic control. Different systems, the U.S. and USSR, but fear was a powerful motivator in both.
Okay, so fast forward to the 1980s. Things started to shift. Both superpowers were facing challenges economically, politically, but the Soviet Union especially was really struggling. Their planned economy just wasn't keeping up. And then Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power, and he introduces these radical reforms, glasnost and perestroika.
Yeah, those are game changers. Glasnost meant openness, More freedom of speech, more discussion of problems. People could actually talk about the system's failings. And perestroika meant restructuring, trying to inject some market principles, some decentralization into the creaking Soviet economy. These reforms, combined with, ongoing pressure from the West, especially the U.S. under Reagan, just unleashed forces that couldn't really be contained anymore.
And the symbol of that change, the most potent symbol maybe, the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. It had stood for nearly 30 years as this brutal physical divide. And then suddenly people are just chipping away at it, climbing over it. It was incredible. It felt like the end right there.
And the actual end wasn't far behind. December 1991, the Soviet Union itself just collapses, dissolves. The economy was shot. Nationalism was rising in the different republics. Gorbachev's reforms had loosened the center's grip. Just sort of unraveled. And that was it. The Cold War was officially over. Astonishing, really.
So thinking back, that question we started with, how did these wartime allies turn into such bitter enemies so fast? It wasn't just about who had more power after the war, was it?
No, not just power. It was fundamentally about ideology. Each side saw the other's entire system as a direct threat to its own existence, its own vision for the world. The U.S. saw Soviet communism as this aggressive, totalitarian force that had to be stopped. The Soviets saw U.S. capitalism as inherently greedy, imperialistic, needing to be overthrown. With that kind of fundamental conflict, cooperation was almost doomed from the start. It became a zero-sum game.
And what about something like the Marshall Plan? Was it just generosity or was it strategy? The sources suggest it was, well, both right. It definitely helped people, prevented chaos. And it also absolutely served U.S. interests by building strong, stable, democratic allies in Western Europe who wouldn't fall to communism. It makes you think, how often do good intentions and self-interest mix in world politics? Historians still argue about the exact balance there.
Exactly. And thinking about the Cuban Missile Crisis again, how close did we really get? The consensus among historians is terrifyingly close, millimeters away perhaps. It's a chilling reminder of the immense pressure on leaders in those moments and how easily things could have spiraled out of control. It certainly led to better communication channels afterwards, like the hotline, a lesson learned the hard way.
And that crazy, costly arms race. Why build all those weapons knowing they could end everything? You mentioned it earlier, it boiled down to fear and deterrence.
Yeah, that MAD logic. Having enough power to obliterate the other side was supposed to make using that power unthinkable, a terrible paradox, and security through mutually assured destruction.
It's also really important, I think, to remember that history isn't just one story. People experienced the Cold War very differently depending on where they lived.
Absolutely. How an American historian views the division of Europe or the fall of the Soviet Union might be very different from, say, a Russian perspective, where the collapse might be seen more as a national tragedy, a loss of status, or someone from Eastern Europe who experienced Soviet domination directly.
Right, so understanding history means engaging with all those different viewpoints, doesn't it? Not just finding the right answer, but appreciating the complexity, the different motivations, the different experiences, sifting through those sources yourself.
And the legacy of the Cold War is just immense. It shaped borders, economies, political systems all over the globe. Alliances like NATO are still here. International bodies were formed or strengthened in response to it.
Plus the technology.
Yeah.
Nuclear tech, obviously, but also space exploration, computers, the internet.
Yeah.
So much of our modern tech has roots in that Cold War competition. Pushed innovation in unexpected ways.
It's true. Even things like arms control treaties or the growth of the European Union, you can trace their origins, at least partly, back to the dynamics and lessons of the Cold War era. We live in a world profoundly shaped by it.
And it's not really over, in some ways, is it? The political maps, the alliances, the unresolved conflicts, even the existence of nuclear weapons, they're all still with us, influencing today's international relations.
Definitely. The Cold War offers some stark lessons about how quickly tensions can escalate, about the absolute necessity of diplomacy and communication, even between adversaries with totally opposing values, because the alternative is just unthinkable.
And ultimately, it's a human story, isn't it? Millions living under that nuclear shadow, leaders making agonizing choices. Societies changed forever. It really underlines why learning from history, understanding those different perspectives, is so crucial.
The Cold War might be history, technically, but its echoes are all around us. The structures it built, the fears it embedded, they still resonate.
So maybe the question for you listening is this. Looking back at that half-century of superpower conflict, what lessons feel most relevant for the challenges we're facing right now? globally? And how do we make sure we actually use those lessons from history instead of just letting them fade into a forgotten echo?